Hi, my name is Ciara Emery. I'm a graduate student with Humboldt State University, and the title of my project is Bringing Climate Change Home to Meet Your Viewshed, Stakeholder Perceptions of Offshore Wind Energy Development in Humboldt County, California. So what this project really is about is the increased federal effort to lease offshore renewable energy lease blocks off the west coast of the United States. So that is run through the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, a federal agency under the Department of Interior, and they identify federal leasing blocks that could be purchased by developers for offshore renewable energy projects. There are three areas identified by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in California specifically, and one of them is off the coast of Humboldt County, California. The primary technology for these renewable energy lease blocks is wind energy, and this is floating wind turbines in farms. And Humboldt County, like I said, is one of those areas that developers are interested in and that will be leased in 2021. So there are several questions that come out of this evolving conversation. Those involve technology, environmental impacts, but more specifically, I'm interested in the ways that stakeholders are expecting to interact in a development process, how they feel about the technology, how they feel about the leasing situation. So that led me to three research questions. The first is, what do stakeholders perceive as the benefits and concerns of offshore wind energy generation in Humboldt County? The second is, how do stakeholders feel about the process so far? And that's about the BOEM leasing process. And third is, how does the reality of climate change impact those stakeholder perceptions of offshore wind energy development in Humboldt County? And that third question is really trying to get at the fact that Humboldt itself is a very environmentally minded community. And basically, we're trying to find out the ways that Humboldt County uses its views of climate change to interact with that development process. So there are three methods that I've identified here. The first is semi-structured interviews. I did 26 stakeholder interviews with Humboldt County stakeholders. I just want to emphasize that the term stakeholder is sort of a loaded term. In this case, I just mean that there are groups that have interacted with past development projects, both in Humboldt County and in other renewable energy projects across the country. That's based off of the literature. And so we've identified here energy industry, local government, environmental groups, the fishing industry, and labor. You will notice that tribes are not on this list. That is intentional. Tribes have very unique and long-standing legal mechanisms, government-to-government consultation ability with both the state and federal government. And I really feel like that regulatory framework should be identified in a different thesis. The second method is participant observation. I attended 14 public meetings on the North Coast, and I attended 2 conferences, one in Sacramento and one in Portland, Oregon. And third is document analysis, and that's primarily analyzing BOEM leasing documents. So moving into the findings, this graph shows stakeholder perceptions of the benefits of offshore wind in Humboldt County. So the most cited benefit is climate change or fossil fuel reduction. Second is jobs in the economy. Third is energy independence and local control, having to import less energy. Fourth is port upgrades. That really gets at improvements to Humboldt Bay. And then fifth, and perhaps the most interesting, is 5 out of 26 stakeholders said that perhaps an offshore wind project would have less visual or environmental impacts than an onshore project. Moving on to stakeholder concerns. The most cited concern was environmental impacts. The environmental impacts primarily included impacts to mammal species, impacts to avian species, impacts to fish populations. And then the last one was land impacts. And that really hits at the idea that perhaps you might need a grid, an infrastructure upgrade on land to be able to export the power. And there was a concern about that. The next cited concern were impacts to fishermen and the fishing fleet. Every fisherman interviewed expressed a concern about the impacts to the fishing fleet from an offshore project, and at least one member of all other stakeholder categories expressed that same concern. Third is a change of scale, and that is stakeholders concerned that the project would end up being much bigger than developers are saying that it could be now. And then fourth is cost, and that's both cost to the ratepayers and cost of the project in terms of viability as a whole. So I just want to emphasize the impacts to the fishing fleet again. The fishing fleet is very concerned both about loss of fishing ground, fish behavior with the metal in the water, and also their access in and out of the harbor. Fishermen really just want to be fishing. And so one fisherman said, the realities are the fishing industry needs some really bitchin' lobbyists. They felt like they were underrepresented in their ability to attend all the meetings, in their ability to work with federal partners. So they felt like they were one of the stakeholders that was the most impacted by a project. Moving on to that second question, the process. There were 4 themes identified in the BOEM leasing process. The first one is the leasing process itself and the amount of meetings in the North Coast. Stakeholders really felt like there were too many meetings, and they weren't sure how useful those meetings were. They didn't feel like information was shared both ways. Second was clarity and transparency. BOEM leasing process is very confusing, and some stakeholders felt like it was supposed to be confusing. They felt like perhaps the federal government didn't want them to know all the information they needed to know. And that goes to the fourth bullet point, which is trust. Stakeholders felt like they needed to be able to trust that a process would be fair, that they would be able to submit comments and information, and those comments would be included in the planning process. And then moving up to that third bullet point, local relationships were really important. And that was really about having some sort of local entity be involved in the development process to have that local accountability there. So moving on to that third question, which is what I'm calling the climate though, there are 3 main ways that stakeholders utilize their feelings of climate change to think about the offshore wind development project. The first is some stakeholders felt like the urgency of climate change meant that we should be less concerned about the negative impacts of a development project. The second group of folks felt like the impacts from the development project were disproportionately on them, and so they felt like that was not a reason, climate change was not a reason to build this specific project. But the vast majority of stakeholders felt like they were uncertain. They were uncertain about the way that climate change is manifesting locally, and they were also uncertain about how they should use that information to pursue or not pursue a specific development project. And that also plays into the development process itself. Local permitting, the BOEM leasing process really does not take into account the no build option. And that would be, what are the negative impacts, because climate change is already occurring, what are the negative impacts of not building something? And that really isn't addressed in much of our regulatory or permitting framework. So those were the main themes, the ways that stakeholders used climate change in this conversation. And really the conclusion here is that while Humboldt might be an environmentally minded community, it's obvious that the conversation on the ground is actually extremely complex. Stakeholders don't know how they feel about what concerns to raise about a development project when it comes to climate change. So there are several areas of future research. That's analysis further on in the development process, doing that tribal work, and then analyzing past development projects and really focusing on this community development, local ownership piece. So I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.